Hello and welcome to the How to Exit podcast, where we introduce you to a world of small to medium business acquisitions and mergers. We interview business owners, industry leaders, authors, mentors, and other influencers with the sole intent to share with you what it looks like to buy or sell a business. Let's get rolling. And now a moment for our sponsors. I want to highly recommend you get Acquisition Aficionado magazine. Every month, Acquisition Aficionado magazine brings you tactics for business buying and selling you won't find anywhere else. Learn firsthand from industry leaders who share their success stories, featuring in-depth interviews and stories from leading figures in the business acquisition industry. This multi-platform mobile magazine speaks to acquisition entrepreneurs wherever they are in the journey. And I want you to visit acquisitionaficionado.com today. Hello and welcome to the How to Exit podcast. Today I'm here with Gregory Caruso, who is a business valuator with over 40 years experience. And we're going to talk about all kinds of different ways that companies are valued, different reasons why they would have a valuation done, and just really kind of get into that world. Thank you for being here today, Greg. So I think we're going to start off with your background story, kind of how did you get in the space? You've spent 40 years in the space, so kind of tell us your history and a different type of how you progressed through this industry so that we can kind of know who we're speaking with today.
Sure. Well, I started with a JD and a CPA. So I'm actually licensed in the state of Maryland for both of those, even though I don't directly use them. I certainly use that knowledge every day because in valuation, professional judgment is a big piece of what we do, and it helps.
Mm-hmm.
I spent 10 years running a family home building operation. It's not where I fit. We got up to 70 houses a year though. So I have a better understanding of what management is really dealing with than most people who are doing valuations who maybe ran a professional practice. And then since then, I have been predominantly in business brokerage, which I stopped doing about 5 years ago, and business valuation combined, which is it keeps you humble because you realize no matter how good you think you are at valuing things, price and value can be two different concepts. They are two different concepts and they don't always align. We can maybe talk about that. I wrote a book on valuing smaller businesses, the art of business valuation. It is really geared towards businesses with revenues under about 10 million a year. It was published by Wiley. I ran a continuing education, a monthly 2-hour webinar for 4 years for the NACVA, where I was both the editor-in-chief and the host, which really let me spread my wings and get to know a lot of the valuation community and a lot more variety of opinions. So those are a few things I've done that certainly impact how I view things.
Awesome. And over the years, have the models changed? I see reports all the time saying like the Ivy Leagues and some of the MBA programs have upwards to 120 to 140 different potential valuation models. What I see in the market, correct me if I'm wrong, there's usually a set of 3 or 4 that are typically used most common. Is that true, and have they changed over the years?
The models are always being tweaked, but in most cases, the changes are small. There's a lot of detail areas. Like when all the tax changes came out, when Trump came in, there was for a couple of years, and frankly, there were some court cases that also created it. There were a lot of issues around tax affecting, where people came up with models for that specific smaller area of valuation that does impact value. So if you start counting all of those things, yes, there's hundreds of models. The reality is when I'm doing evaluation for compliance or where it needs to get accepted by the community at large, there's a few much more established models and they're going to make up the bulk of the value. And again, we're constantly tweaking them, and some of the theories are changing, but it's the same basic 4 or 5 models.
Are they regulated by any sense by like if you're doing one for the ESOP community versus the Small Business Administration versus something else? Do they have?
Um, well, on all valuations, the first thing I, as a evaluator, if you called me, would ask you is, what's the purpose? Why are we doing this? Well, as soon as you tell me the purpose, if you tell me it's an ESOP, then yes, as you indicated, the Department of Labor, ESOPs are regulated both by the Department of Labor and the IRS, but it's predominantly the Department of Labor. They've said some things they want. Well, we make sure we get them in those valuations. The SBA has some things they want. They have a statement of policy, which only has about 3 pages on business valuation in the 500-page book. But between that and what we've learned in the community, they have specific things. So again, purpose will add some things that may be included or excluded from evaluation. For instance, an ESOP with the Department of Labor, they really want a forecast, maybe a 5-year forecast, and discounted cash flow. The SBA views that as somewhat speculative and would rather not have a forecast. They would rather us use a valuation. While we're always looking to the future, they'd rather have us use a method that looks to the history of the company much more.
Yeah, I get the speculation side of it because, like, I see why the SBA would be a little more reluctant because they're loaning money. Like, they're putting some skin in the game, right? To whereas the labor is trying to get money out of the program, or the IRS is trying to get money out of the program. So they're wanting to go, wanting to see, where this has potential. And there's also data collection statistics I'm sure they're looking for, right? Is allowing ESOPs to do what they do, increasing, tax revenues or decreasing them? Is converting these companies from owner operated and owner run to employee operated or employee run, helping them grow or hurting them? So I'm sure there's reasons why they want that, gathered some of that statistics too. Talk about let's class everything first. You do things for estate, like gift tax and estate planning, ESOPs. What are the different types of valuations that come across your desk or request anyway?
Okay, our simplest is we will do a calculation of value, which is a lower level where we define the work. We basically say we're going to do this amount of work. That's a calculation. An opinion, when we issue an opinion, our standards say we've done everything we feel is necessary to come up with this value. No restriction. We do a lot of calculations for exit planning. Again, an owner wants to gift to his children, but they haven't started figuring it out and they need a range. An owner wants to do a market sale and they need an indication for their planning purposes. We do a lot of that type of work. We do a lot of work for when they're gifting. They've got a nice business and they either think it's going to grow or it's time estate-wise to gift it, where a minority interest usually is going to be gifted to usually children. There's actually rules. You can't gift it to employees. It's considered work, no matter what you want to call it. And then estate tax if you die owning businesses. And then we do a lot of ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. They need to be valued every year because employees are coming in and out of the plan. And then we also do a good number of SBA, which are smaller, usually simpler businesses. We really like them because you kind of can get in and out of that valuation. They're almost fun because they're very defined.
Yeah. I think we'll stay away from the SBA a little bit. We interviewed a guy a couple of weeks ago, and
That's fine.
his show is going to be he does like him and his little team does. I think they said 1,200 to 1,400 SBA valuations a year. So they're busy in that realm. So we asked a lot of questions on that already. So I really want to talk about the differences between kind of the estate planning, because I get it occasionally where I'm talking to a business owner. He goes, "Yeah, I had it valued for my estate, for our trust and our will and our planning purposes. The company's worth X." And then when I get down into it, I was like, I don't know how they got to the number, because often it seems low, to be honest. And it may be low by design because they're trying to avoid taxes, and they're just trying to get a fair number to where. And if I'm the buyer, that sounds awesome. But a lot of times what'll happen is I'm working with somebody and they want me to help them grow a little bit before they exit. That's kind of my realm, where I'll help them
Mhm.
acquire a competitor or something, and we'll do. They want to finish some things first, and I have to tell them, like, that seems really low compared to what's going on in the market. It may be because it's a few years old too. So what's the difference between somebody that comes in for an estate or whatever, and then the market, like the current market value? Do they not follow
Sure.
the? Yeah.
Well, first of all, we've got a lot of defined terms in our business.
Mhm.
An awful lot of things are defined and people don't necessarily understand the definition. They think they do, and
Mhm.
so they start making assumptions.
Mm.
So the first one is, what is fair market value? If you talk to evaluators, they'll start talking about the standard of value all the time. Standard of value, standard of value. It's sort of like a summary of deal terms.
Mhm.
When you negotiate a transaction, you've got a 20, 40, 60-page document. You've got earnouts, you've got clawbacks, you've got reps and warranties. Well, we've got basically 3 sentences or 4 sentences that define it. Now, the
Mhm.
most common standard of value, and the one that is required for IRS work, is fair market value. Fair market value is a hypothetical buyer, not any particular one, and a hypothetical seller, not any particular, not even you. Now, it's your business, but it's not you and whatever's going on in your brain. It's this reasonable person. I've never honestly met a reasonable person doing a brokerage deal, which is a whole different conversation. It's this reasonable person with reasonable knowledge, with reasonable whatever on both sides. Now, this person in most cases does not have synergies as part of the definition. Now, I'm sure your audience knows synergies well, but the simplest synergy to visualize is, I've got two trucks that are half empty going down the same road with two companies. Obviously, if one of the companies is going to buy the other, that buyer is going to make more money because they're now going to have one full truck. Nobody else will have that advantage. That's a synergy. Fair market value says we can't take synergies into account. So right away, if you have a tech company or a company in an industry with high synergies, where there often are synergies, that's not part of my valuation. I'm doing my best to pull that value enhancement out and get back to fair market value. So that's item one. The second item is, what is the interest I'm valuing? Everybody always thinks, or at least people who don't do this a lot, well, you're valuing the company. Well, yes, I am valuing the company. But in the case of an estate and gift tax, or estate gift tax and some of these more sophisticated ones, I'm valuing a defined interest. Now, if that interest is a minority owner, someone's going to own 10%, and they have a buy sell agreement that says they can't really do much with this unless the primary owner decides to sell, or decides or approves it, or, it's very restricted shares.
Mhm.
Well, now we got the situation of, the driver of a car is in a very different situation than the passenger. And it's probably better to be the driver, especially when you start having, the challenges that come up in business every day. So there are all kinds of discounts for this restricted stock, because again, I'm along for the ride. I don't get to make the decisions, The majority owner may decide to give himself a $500,000 salary a year when 200 would be appropriate. Well, there's at some point there's things but you can do, but not much. So again, there's a lot of discounts because you would not pay as much for that minority interest as you would pay for the control. And so those can start between the fair market value versus synergistic and the discounts. It might be 40 or 50% less than what that company would sell to on the public market.
Do you get a lot of work for those type of, you mentioned key man policies and that type of stuff, buy sell agreements? I've seen some of those insurance policies and some of those agreements require valuations to set their value. Do you get to do, or is that something you end up doing often?
We tend to do buy sell more when they're actually trying to buy somebody out
Okay.
than there's people related to the insurance companies that do most of those. They don't need a high standard. They just need to make sure there really is an insurable interest. It's not a fraudulent transaction. But later on, if one of the partners dies, or if one of the partners wants to leave, or the other partners decide they're going to leave, we certainly do valuations in those interests and those in instances.
So, who is your? I'm gonna ask a couple of questions to kind of set my other questions up, so I know
Mhm.
where to go with them. Who's your typical customer? Is it the business owner itself, or a lot of times is it agencies and advisors and that type of stuff?
Usually it is the owner, but sometimes, depending what we're doing, the attorney may hire us because once the attorney decides to use and publish the valuation, it's public, it's out there. I mean, and by public, I mean for the user. If we send it to the
Right.
IRS, anything I did, I have to share with the IRS,
Right.
not with the general public. But if they decide they didn't like what I did, the attorney has confidentiality, it disappears. So occasionally we will get hired by the attorney, but usually we're working for the business owners directly.
Do you get the chance occasionally? Now I know you have. I heard you say you have a JD. I'm pretty sure I heard you say you have a CPA too.
Mhm.
Wow. So
Yeah, I'm licensed in Maryland, but I don't practice either.
that's the reason. But you have that knowledge in the back of your head. So when you're looking through this, how do are you familiar with the term cognitive biases? Like we have when we have certain education and stuff, we have certain lenses we look through, right? How do you look through those with both a financial lens and a legal lens? And do the evaluations? I mean, I know we do legal due diligence and financial due diligence and all this other stuff, but that usually only impacts the valuation by most models. If you found something, so bad, you got to go back and renegotiate. The math models I've seen don't have like any type of risk factor in there. With your background, are the models that you use actually to look for legal exposure and financial exposure due to the quality of earnings and stuff?
We always disclaim that because of the level of review we're giving it. If somebody has a current legal issue and it's material, while I would get a letter from the attorney on the assessment and the likelihood and what they believe the damages range would be,
Mhm,
because that's what my standards say I'm to do.
mhm.
My background certainly helps me further assess it. Again, one of my favorite quotes, and this from the ASA, is the net result of evaluation is not necessarily a mathematical process, it's judgment. And this is where an experienced valuator that's seen a lot, we all started younger, but
Mhm.
and brings a variety of backgrounds, that's where that judgment pays off. So, and depending, I'm going to find you and stand behind my opinion. Depending on what you want, that may be good or bad. Sometimes
Right.
having a know-nothing valuator, if you want a particularly high or low figure, could be the best thing that ever happened to you. If you want a acceptable and likely to be correct, figure, it's good to have somebody with a lot of experiences.
I bet it is. How do you, so if it's the business owner, a lot of times, you're going through these valuations. I'm sure after 40 years, you've seen a pattern of that's the reason I was asking how many of it you did for business owners as opposed to institutional. The pattern of, if these companies would just fix X, Y, and Z, they would do so much, like it would improve their valuation by so much. What's the biggest low-hanging fruit, I would say, that people just don't get right that impacts these valuations you're doing?
The lowest
Mhm.
is profitability. People show up and tell me, oh, it has so much potential. And if you're a really large business and you can do a forecast that may or may not get accepted by your buying public, your prospective purchasers, that's one thing. But if you're in a smaller, and by smaller, I'm still talking 30, 40 million, 50 million of revenues. If you're in a smaller business, I mean, outside of certain tech areas, and you got to prove it. And the nice thing about increasing profitability is profitability, business valuation is we make it very complex, but it's really very simple. It's future cash flow and the risk of making it. And the really cool thing about profitability is the more profitable you are, it reduces your risk and it increases your cash flow. So it's a win-win. The other big thing I see happen a lot, and I've mainly worked with more traditional type businesses, is the owner is 65, got a nice business, got 3 or 4 key people. Only the problem is they've been with them since almost the start. And when you go to them, well, what are you planning on doing when Joe here retires, who you've worked for 20 plus years and, you know, get along with and respect? And they go, oh, well, we're retiring with them. Well, usually the buyer is more interested in the management team. These things don't run themselves, no matter how automated we are. There are going to be problems. Having seen it before is really helpful. Just knowing how the process works. So that's a huge impediment to value. And that can be a tough one because if you're not growing, it means you got to either spend extra money on someone or you've got to get rid of one of these people you love. In many of these cases where they've worked together 20 years, they're family. They really are family.
It's interesting in that I've seen a few of these where, like, I told the story on this podcast probably a dozen times about the engineering firm out of Dallas where I met with the owner. He's retiring, and I happened to go to their website. I hadn't met with any of the other executives left. It was a smaller company, less than 25, 30 people. There were 4 people on the management level on his website that were like director of this, response CFO, and they all were his age or older. So I told him, I said, we probably need to talk to those guys. And, he let me talk to 2 of them, and both of them said, oh, we're the one pushing him to retire. We're waiting for him to retire so we can retire.
Right.
He's in, and a company of, I think, 16 to 20 people, 5 of them, him and his 4 top execs, 5 of them are leaving within 6 months because they're all trying to push him out. They're only there out of loyalty for him to help him keep it. They're the one pushing him to sell. They got a problem, right? And they haven't groomed anybody underneath them to step up. And this is like this was an engineering firm that would get contracts to repair bridges and like re-level skyscrapers that are starting to like settle out. They
But
did like engineering tests like you wouldn't believe. They would come in and solve problems on like how to, you could level a house pretty easy by spraying some foam underneath or putting some piers underneath. Think about trying to do that to 11-story building.
Well, I will say this. Engineering firms are with that problem are probably more transferable than a lot of them
Oh yeah.
because the management of those, if assuming the technical work is being done by people who are staying, engineering firms, there's a lot of them, and they are very, there's a lot of them that are quite similar.
Right.
So it's not, again, some of this varies with the industry and the size. Now you get a 400 person firm with that problem, you probably have a big problem because there's just so much going on. How does somebody step in and figure it out in 6 months? So
Interesting.
again, and that's where judgment comes in. And the one thing I learned brokering is you don't always get judgment right. Price, when you go to sell, price is a response to the market. And how bad does the seller want to sell? How bad does the buyer want to buy? Did two or three people raise their hand and express interest at the same time and get into a bidding war? No, there's a tremendous amount of emotion. There's a little bit of luck. There's working with people who really do it right. And then again, with the emotion, there's making the right decisions when they come along. There's this thing, deal heat. You get up, it's sort of, I equate it to love.
Mm-hmm.
When you fall in love with somebody, there could be 1,000 people in the room and you're just like this.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to negotiate your deal when that's when the buyer has mentally bought you and wants you and has counted their money, even though they're telling you they haven't. If you can put it together then, and all those factors impact price. When I do a valuation, I'm looking at you rationally, and I'm looking at tables of transactions, and I'm looking at other types of data to come up with risk. And it's rational. I'm rational. I'm not emotionally involved. So what you find out is, value is what it kind of should be, which we all know about the word should, and price is what actually happened.
Inside of both these worlds, when you value something, it's not just a numeric algorithm. There's a lot has to come into play. There's a lot of, like in the housing world, you could have pocket neighborhoods that are worth $1 million homes in an area where everything else around it is $300,000 and $400,000 home, but you happen to be right against the little lake in town or something, right? You can't do the standard, well, give me a 1 mile radius of everything sold in the last 30 days because you're going to get a lot of lowball, sales. You have to use that restricted gated area. And the same thing has to happen in this business things. There are certain things in this industry, there's certain trends in this industry that you as a evaluator, I'm sure you have to be aware of, right? Was it 3 years ago, not even 2, 3 years ago, SaaS companies were insane. If you did a valuation on a software as a service company, and you started looking at market conditions, that had to be frustrating to somebody that's been in the business as long as you did because it wasn't rational. Do you get that a lot?
We certainly see it. What I would tell you is two things. One, that does happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of these software as a service companies raised a lot of money and then couldn't figure out how to make that work. So they went out and bought regular on the ground companies for very high prices and made a lot of sellers extremely happy. Made me look bad on my valuations because they paid like double what they were worth. But they had money and they needed product quickly because what they didn't want to do is give the money back or have no revenues. What we always tell people is if you get that kind of offer, if there is a roll up in your industry and they're making above synergistic offers, think hard about taking it because that's not going to be the normal market. Those come and go. And if you're somebody in a position to sell, or if the money really is too good to be true, don't think, gee whiz, 3 years later from now, I'm going to get an even better offer, because there are situations where things get overvalued, just like on the public exchanges. And sometimes you're not in a position in life to take advantage of it. But if you are, strike while the iron is hot.
So we talked about the low hanging fruit of profitability. What are some of the other things that people can take a look at and have the best opportunity to increase valuation?
Probably the biggest item that isn't really a business item is usually the owner themselves. I do a presentation geared a little more to professionals on preparing for your exit. And again, we don't take people through the process, but we've certainly learned what it takes. And we'd love to do evaluation for those people when, anywhere along the line where they're thinking about it. And the biggest issue most people have is their own limitations. We're human and we don't see ourselves accurately. We don't think we're going to die. We don't think we're going to retire. We don't think our client is going to get as good a job with our key lieutenant who's probably done the bulk of the work for 20 years with us than without us. And that gets into delegating. In order to grow a business, you got to be able to let go. Because if you can't let go, you max out on what you can do with a fairly small business. So you've got to understand how to let go. You've got to learn how to find people who, okay, they're only going to be 98% as good as you. But, how do we develop systems so that these things work? I had a unusual childhood. My dad ran a gigantic general contractor, and he always said a good system is when average people get exceptional results every time, because you can't have a superstar in all 40 of your positions, and again, being able to step back, either develop those processes or work with the people and teach your people to develop the processes. Now, again, this will be before most of your listeners' time, but I'm a big fan of Edward Deming, who went to Japan because the American car makers wouldn't listen to him. And, his big thing was, if we show workers how to manage themselves, how to manage quality, how to understand why they need to do this volume and track it themselves, we don't need a whole layer of bureaucracy of inspectors. And B, most people want to perform and want to do well, and your companies will do better. And again, going from, a great tradesperson to a business owner, and from having to do everything yourself, which typically a lot of small businesses you have to do in the beginning, and let it go. Those are huge steps in building value.
Let's just jump over to the ESOP thing. So the employee stock ownership programs. There's multiple valuations that are done in that, right? There's the first one that happens when the owner's thinking about, selling it to the employees. And then there's I guess it's a regulatory probably requirement of a yearly valuation because of employees going in and out. Does that initial one, what does the initial valuation look like in compared to, and here's the approach I'm taking. I'm a business owner and I have the choice of either selling my business to my employees and funding my retirement, or through an ESOP, or taking it to the open market. I know there's some strategic buyers outliers that are going to drive that. It could be that synergies buyers. If you remove the strategic buyers out there and just look at market conditions versus the ESOP, is there a disparity? Is there a difference?
Well, I'm hearing 2 or 3 questions there.
Okay.
So disguised as one. So let me try to answer a couple of your questions that I'm hearing. The first one is, by regulation on all ESOP valuations, we have to do fair market value. The rules say that it cannot be a synergistic valuation, which makes sense because your management doesn't have synergies. So
Right.
if we did that valuation, we would be setting these up for failure. So while it is by law, it also does make sense if you think about what you're doing here. So right away, some industries are more synergistic than others. If you're in a tech spot, where there's real synergies, because if I've got great code, there's other people who maybe can distribute it many times better. An ESOP is going to be tough if you're doing it as a sale. Some people do partial ESOPs as a benefit and as a way to share the wealth with all the employees with not having a lot of direct shareholders. Because what an ESOP does is it creates a trust, and the trustee represents all of those shareholders, but they have the benefits of ownership, particularly in good companies that are going up in value. And it is a retirement plan, so it's extremely regulated. So the first thing is, if the synergies are too strong, if the buyer is doing it to maximize their return, it is going to be difficult. If a lot of industries don't have tremendous synergies, a lot of construction related, they're good businesses, but they're management intensive. And there are some synergies, but usually it's okay. We're in 3 cities and we want to go to a 4th, but it's management intensive. It's not like in some other industries. And so in those businesses, ESOPs make a lot of sense. They have some costs. There are some restrictions, but there's very good tax benefits, and they vary with the situation and the tax status of the company. But like 100% S corp, if it's 100% owned by the ESOP, it doesn't pay federal taxes. That's really nice. And so through some of those things, through some of those mechanisms, it can, and depending on how it's all structured, it can bring value, and it can make it as good or better than a likely market sale. Again, if you're in one of those freak circumstances where, somebody with an unusual amount of money is making crazy offers, it may not match that,
Okay.
but it makes a lot of them work well.
Okay. And then, so the initial valuation happens, and then you do a yearly one just because of the, setting in the options world, the strike price, right? You gotta set the price of what those shares are worth on a yearly basis. So that's just part of the
Yeah,
regulation. I mean,
in all cases, again, this fair market value concept is a very big deal because
yep.
the ESOP is not allowed to overpay for things. So they are quite complex. They typically use a discounted cash flow.
Hmm.
The Department of Labor does want a forecast. Now, again, part of a forecast, you have pro formas and you have forecasts. Pro forma, like when we build houses, we did 3 pro formas. We did sort of our goal. We did what we really thought was going to happen. And we did this is a cyclical industry, the bottom falls out, which we could never quite make work, but it did force us in our heads to decide how we would address that. So if it did happen, it wasn't, we weren't deer in headlights. We had thought about it. A forecast is the most likely to happen. So this should be reasonable. It can only be reasonable based on what's known or knowable as of the valuation date. And the reason we have to have a cutoff is, if you did your valuation 2 weeks before COVID in the restaurant industry, it changed a lot of things. So we have what's known or knowable, and I can argue about knowable to the end of time, but that's what it is. That's the point. And then we generally will do about a 5-year forecast. Now, it depends on the cash flows. Sometimes we'll go out 7 or 10 years. Sometimes it's 3 years, but it has to be reasonable. So we spend a lot of time as valuators tying it into the historic, listening to management. What's changed in the world that you're going to have 20% growth for the next 3 years? If it makes sense, if it's supportable, and you've got the team that can do it, and maybe you're a year in, well, fantastic. So again, it's all analysis and judgment. If you just take a hockey stick and put a little discount on it and then come up with this fantastic value, you're probably going to have a problem sooner or later with the regulators with your ESOP. But they want a forecast, and we spend a lot of time working on those with our clients to find, what's really reasonable, particularly with the growth ones.
So how does that impact things for the valuation? Is the forecast, does it drastically change depending on like if a company, if you give it a good example, if a company looks like it's just going to be slow and steady, like say 2 to 5% growth over year after year, just barely beating inflation, versus one that looks like it can do industry killing 20-25% growth year over year, is that drastically change the valuation as far as the ESOP goes?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's going to dramatically because we're going to use a discounted cash flow method.
Yeah.
So basically what we do is we estimate a discount rate,
Hmm.
usually using the build-up method where we look to the public markets and then we add a factor for this particular company because it's not public. It's far riskier and smaller in most cases. And we're going to take that and then we're going to create a present value factor from that for each of the 5 years. And for each of these discrete defined years, we're going to multiply the projected cash flow in that year against the discount factor to come up with the value. And then we do like a capitalization of earnings 5 years out and present value in. So if I have a company that's growing dramatically, it's going to produce a higher value. Now, I am going to remember it's cash flow and risk. If I have a company that's growing dramatically and they're 3 years in and they say they're going to do it 3 more years, well, that's kind of proven. I mean, versus a company that's grown at 3%, and now the world's changed and they're going to grow at 20, but we can't really document why. I mean, it's all making sense. Well, I'm going to have a higher discount rate because the likelihood of them making that forecasted cash flow is less. There's more risk in it.
Hmm.
Any rational investor is going to go, okay, I'll buy into that, but I'm not buying into that at a 20% return. I'm buying into that at a 30% return because I'm taking, so that process goes in on our valuations. That's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to step in the role of the rational investor and determine what would we pay for this. Now, again, remember, I've got this definition of fair market value. So I'm not the synergistic one. I am the sort of, management's buying it out, financial buyer. I can't do synergies that an outsider might bring.
How does the quality of the books, like even going as far as like a quality of earnings report or something like that, to where you have a third party saying this is true and accurate, how does that impact valuation? Does it just make your job easier, or does it really impact the true value of the company?
In most cases, it makes our job easier. At some point, it impacts your value. Or, I had one 2 years ago. I couldn't, they had 20 million in revenues. And the only thing I know is they're telling me they have 20 million in revenues. Nothing tied, nothing added up. I do keep my CPA license, which means I have to follow the AICPA standards, and they kind of think counting counts. So as a valuator, my job is to look. If it makes sense, I don't have to dig in. But if something doesn't make sense, I'm required to ask. And if it doesn't make sense and then it does with the answer, great. I'm not an auditor. I'm not your financial person. I'm allowed to rely on, but if you get into one of those cycles where each answer it gets worse, at some point we can't do an opinion. We can do a calculation because in a calculation I can kind of say, couldn't get comfortable with the books. And here's what we came up with. In an opinion, I have to be comfortable that the books are reasonable for what I'm looking at. So obviously a small business with organized internals, maybe under 5 or 10 million, no problem. At some point, we'd like to see reviewed, which is not an audit, but it's at least the outside accountant is giving sniff tests. And then at some point, if you're really large, or if you're in an industry where things are just super complex, you might want an audit, particularly if you're going to go to market, simply because it's going to make your buyers many times more comfortable. And again, an audit is not a quality of earnings, but it is somebody is going through it and, making sure you're not playing too many games with when you're recognizing income. which is what a quality of earnings does also. And I would suggest any buyer, if it's a small business, have your accountant go in and tie a couple months into the bank statements. If it's a larger business, you get a quality of earnings where you make sure they're not playing games with the timing to smooth. It's good management to want to smooth out so that you're always going up a little bit. So I understand why management has the drive to do that. But volatility up and down, again, creates risk in buyers' minds. And it creates risk. I mean, if you have to get out when it's down, you're in trouble. So again, you want to understand that even if it's just when the money is coming in, you want to understand that as a buyer. And we always tell sellers, you should do this in advance. You should actually let the broker or let whoever you're working with go through as if they were a buyer so that you have all the documentation ready. Because it's a funny thing, trust is a narrow thing and there's not too much of it in buying and selling businesses. And you get this, well, I asked for it 2 weeks ago and I don't have it. What's going on? It's an assumption they're cheating, not that they're more worried about getting the trucks off the loading dock than cleaning up their books. So we really strongly suggest to sellers, do this in advance. And then the advantage also is the broker knows the weaknesses because all businesses have weaknesses. And if you know where they are, then you know how to address them if they're a good broker in a way that a real buyer is going to go, yeah, that's business. That's this business. We know how to handle that. We'll be fine. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I meet with buyers all the time, and one of the things that has happened a couple different times is, talking to a buyer, and he's like, "Yeah, it fell apart during due diligence." And I'm like, "Well, how did it fall apart during due diligence?" And they said, "We figured out that over the last 8 months to 10 months, they've been loading all their clients, preloading them, basically shipping inventory to them, and pre-selling them more inventory than they've ever bought before. And as soon as they sell it to us." Those people are going to eventually go, "Hey, we got all the widgets we need. We don't need to order for another 6 months, so we're going to have to eat that." And I don't know what the seller was thinking, because we always look, unless you're going to do it for 3 years straight, most of us are going to want to see the last 3 years of your financials. But
Well,
they did.
I can tell you, I'm always suspicious when the last year, even the last 2 years. Again, I spent a lot of my life in contractors. My family was contractors. We really know that business.
Hmm.
And there's
Tough
lots of
business
ways for
too.
a year or two I can play with my income. I don't agree with it, but we're certainly always looking for that just because there's so many things that have to be estimated in their financials, and so that's a very common thing we're looking for. And with smaller businesses, though, often the price is set predominantly on the last year. So you really got to look at that. And we look at it in our valuations and try to understand why. When you get to small guys, sometimes it's just they're starting to run the cash through the business so that the buyer can get the loan. That's a nerve-wracking one, but it happens.
I have a fun one for you before we call it a show here. I have a guy I've talked to a few times. He buys laundry mats, bigger ones normally, ones that have 50 or so washers. And that's a cash business. The accounting's always horrible. And one of his audit methods is he wants to see the water bill for the last 12 months. Because he can equate, and I guess this is a thing that they got back when, they say laundering money. The federal prosecutor, the people, the investigators were using this. They could actually tell how much money a laundromat should be making by subpoena and taking their water usage bills. So
Yep.
if they were cleaning money there and not like being legit. So he just took that model. He says, okay, I know if they've used X number of gallons over the last 12 months, their average machine is this. They charge so much per machine. And then everything that's washed there, I'd say 90% of it, 99% of it's dried there. Right. So,
Every business broker in that space
yeah.
knows. I mean, yes, that's such a and again, but then you have the issue of again, he's a synergistic buyer. He knows the business. One of the nice things about synergistic buyers, in some industries, the buyers are synergistic. I mean, and even it's an exception that it's allowed. For instance, accounting firms tend to get bought by accountants.
Right.
Well, they're not real worried about how much money you made because they can go through your files and figure out, are you charging in a range I would charge, or can I push your customers a little bit? And if so, I know my costs. I mean, we're going to convert to my systems, not yours.
He tries to buy it off their books, but he evaluates the value to him based off water usage, right? So there's a
Of course.
negotiation. There's a negotiation. It usually ends up somewhere between those. But he won't come on the show because he doesn't want to give his methods away, because he's getting some of them acquired in pretty good sized cities. He's like, I ain't telling anybody what I'm doing until I get done with it. Right? Some people are like
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah. But I bet there are other industries out there where you can just go, look, I know you have horrible books, but I can see you, like, the cool thing with all the online businesses and stuff I look at recently is almost of it's all of it's online, right? Because you're usually getting online payment methods, you're getting Google Analytics or some type of analytics. The data, I don't have to have you produce data that you typed in. I can have you give me a non-admin password to stuff and see it at the source, right? And unfortunately, there's no uniformity like that inside of brick and mortar companies. There's no way for us to go in and go, I'm going to log in somewhere and see the foot traffic in front of your business versus the foot traffic that walks through your front door.
Right. Well, again, we can always get into rules of thumb, which are not
Mm-hmm.
valuation methods, but if you're looking at a typical business, and first
Mm-hmm.
you got to figure out what that is, they do work as a starting point. Again,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're going to buy where it's a negotiation. The hard part is what's going on the back end. I could sit in the lobby of a hair place and pretty quickly come up with what's going on the front end, probably, if I really was inclined. Lots of industries, if you get into it, have a rules of thumb for how management. One of the big things I didn't mention on management is, most industries, there's shortcuts that are more current than your accounting. Again, today we can have almost instantaneous accounting, particularly in some of these industries.
Mm-hmm.
But it used to be accounting was 60 days behind. So owners would usually have 3 or 4 things they tracked, or their controller tracked it and put it on their desk every day, and maybe a little more extensive, maybe 10 items once a week. And how many prospects came in? How many contracts did we get? What shipped out the back door? Usually you had something on your cash flow. What are our 30-day bills? What are our 30-day cash and receivables? And they could run it from there. And most industries have rules of thumb, have things like that. If you don't know what they are, go to a conference and start asking your competitor on the other side of the country, especially the guys that are making money. And again, that's just a very practical way to learn how to run your business. And you can apply those same shortcuts if you're a buyer in the same industry. It's much easier to buy and get it right, to buy in an industry than sort of that first acquisition in the blue.
Well, I've asked you a lot of questions and we've covered a lot of topics. We're a little over time right now. What do you think? Is there anything you feel like we missed? Is there anything like we should probably cover this real quick and make sure that the listeners know? And then we're definitely going to wrap up with how do people reach out to you, right? So we'll wrap up with that. But right now, did we miss anything?
The only thing I'll say, since this is really about your show is more about growing, and if anyone is still along, what I will say is one of the things you can do as you're building a business is go start talking to your prospective buyers. The conversation is, of course, we're not thinking of selling. And I'm suggesting you do this way before you're thinking of selling. But how do you, especially if you know somebody's done some acquisition, how do you all look at us? How do you underwrite it? You may have met somebody that in 5 years will buy you, but B, you'll start understanding it from the buyer's perspective. Because just like every day on your normal product, you work on ways to make it easier, what the buyer wants. Your business at some point is a product. And if you can find a intellectual property, a better process, a better system, something that a franchise system could put in their 2,000 units that would demonstrably save them some money, well, then you're not going to get a 3 to 5 to 7 multiple that I'm going to tell you for a regular cash flowing business. You're going to get some possibly extraordinary. I had a fat friend who invented better grout. On sales of under $1 million, they sold for 25 or more million because they invented a better grout. And there's billions of dollars sold in grout in the world.
Yeah, if you can come up with
He was
that's a hell
selling
of
his intellectual property more than his business.
Yep.
I'm just saying, keep your eyes open, talk to your prospective buyers, understand what they might want. And is there something like that? I've got a friend that had a pest control business. He came up with better pest control methodologies. He had a chemist relative and they started work. And again, he did the same type of thing. So that's where people get the return, get the, no, I can't believe what they paid you returns.
I appreciate you, man. You are full of knowledge. I'd love to have, we're already, well over our normal time limit here. Let's wrap this one up, and I'm sure I'll have you back in 6 months to a year, whatever makes comfortable for you. As because, I can pick your brain for hours here. You're just full of knowledge and information. Thank you for taking the time today to share your experience and your knowledge. And before we go, how do people get a hold of you if they want to work with you? What's the best way to reach out to you?
We have a website, Art, A-R-T of O-F, B as in business, V as in valuation, artofbv.com. And I am G. Caruso, Greg Caruso, Caruso at artofbv.com. If you get to the website, we've got, phone numbers. I don't think we would know what to do with mail anymore.
Yeah. All right. So I'll make sure that's in the show notes. If you guys are driving and stuff, that you don't have to pull over real quick and write it down or anything. It'll be in the show notes. You'll be able to see it when you get to a safe destination. Thank you for being here today and hang out for a few minutes. We'll call that a show.
Thank you.
I want to announce our new channel partners, the ITX Marketplace. Since 1998, ITX has created $5 billion in value by selling more than 225 IT businesses in 20 countries. ITX works exclusively with IT-enabled businesses generating between $5 million and $30 million who are ready to be sold, and M&A decision makers who are ready to buy. For over 25 years, ITX has developed industry knowledge that helps determine whether a seller is a good fit for their buyers before making the match. ITX Mergers and Acquisition Marketplace we have partnered with has a proprietary database of 50,000 plus global buyers seeking IT service firms, managed service providers, Microsoft service providers, software as a service platforms, and channel partners with Microsoft, Oracle, ServiceNow, and the Salesforce space. If you have an IT-enabled business you're ready to sell, I want you to visit the itexchangenet.com/marketplace. How to exit. That link will be in the show notes. Visit them now.